Dr. Justice é bacharel em Sociologia pela Universidade de Gana, mestre em Pesquisa Criminológica pela Universidade de Cambridge, doutor em Criminologia pela Universidade de Cambridge. Entre 2008 e 2011, foi bolsista de pós-doutorado do Programa Economic and Social Research Council, da Academia Britânica no Fitzwilliam College, Universidade de Cambridge. Dr. Tankeb trabalhou como professor assistente na Universidade de Gana e foi professor associado do Instituto de Criminologia da Universidade de Cambridge. Atualmente é professor de Criminologia e diretor do programa de pós-graduação do Instituto de Criminologia da Universidade de Cambridge. Suas áreas de pesquisa compreendem criminologia comparada, teorias criminológicas, sociologia da lei, práticas políticas, legitimidade e legitimação, justiça organizacional, controle do crime e atores não estatais, democracia e desordem em Gana e corrupção. Seus atuais projetos de pesquisa incluem estudos como as sentenças são estabelecidas em Gana, pena de morte na África e um estudo longitudinal sobre a legitimidade por parte daqueles que exercem poder. Ele vai falar sobre o tema de policing and legitimacy em Gana, vai falar em inglês e depois nós poderemos abrir uma discussão. Welcome.
Okay, could I sit or I have to?
Yes.
Okay, to sit?
I've got to sit, please, because I want to sit.
Okay, all right, okay. Okay, good evening and thank you very much for the invitation. Can you hear me from the back? All right, okay. Thank you very much to the Center for the Study of Violence for this invitation. Really happy to be here with you to share some few thoughts I have about issues of policing in Ghana. I'm going to try to cover a little bit the history and how that history helps us to understand some of the difficulties that policing in post-colonial societies face. Okay. I think we are not strangers in some senses. Ghana and Brazil are very good friends. There are a lot of Brazilian companies in Ghana, especially construction companies, doing a lot of good work in Ghana. And just for those of us who might not be aware where Ghana is, Ghana is located to the west of Africa, surrounded by these countries. The size of the country is just about the same size as the United Kingdom, for those of us who have bothered to look at it. But the population is... Hello? Okay. The population is around 25 million. It's divided into 10 administrative regions, although in terms of policing, we have 11 administrative regions, right? So one national police force, but divided into 11 regional commands, okay? Each of the 10 administrative regions is a police region in and of itself, except the national capital in Accra, where we have two regions within that scope. Okay. There's a little bit of history. The first Europeans to make contact with what used to be called the Gold Coast was the Portuguese, of whom I believe you are familiar. For trading, they said. Later, the Danes came in, established or built a few castles, castles that initially they said were to facilitate trade among or between Europeans and their African contacts. Until later, of course, as we all would have read, the issue of slave trade came in. And slavery was seen to be more profitable than trading in other commodities. But Ghana was formerly ruled by the British, so it's a British colony. In 1874, I don't want to bore you with the history before that, the British formally declared the Gold Coast as their colony. And in 1884-85, we know the Europeans met in Berlin at the Berlin Conference to divide up Africa among themselves. And the main principle there was the idea of effective occupation. So whoever could demonstrate that he was effectively in charge of a territory, more or less, was allowed to retain control over that territory. The first efforts at independence, of course, there were a series of conflicts, civil disobedience, riots, as some people will call it, others will call it independence struggles, resulted in elections in 1951, which allowed a certain level of self-governance by having a prime minister for the first time, or what they called the leader of government business, in the person of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And then in 1957, March 1957, Ghana was formally declared as an independent country. But that didn't mean that the Queen packed her bags and went away. She remained as the head of state until 1960, when the country became a republic, meaning that Ghanaians were then allowed to elect their own head of state. Okay. I think the main issue that I want to cover in this context is the issue of policing within colonial settings. Of course, colonialism as we know it had one principal aim, that of extracting raw material and resources from the colonies. Of course, it was not the way that colonialism was sold. The aim of colonialism, we were told, was to civilize the people within the colonies. That somehow they were animists, people, pagans, who needed Christianity, who needed to be brought to the level of civilization. And therefore, in that sense, it was a very peaceful mission from the standpoint of colonial administrators. It was a mission to help people. But of course, in practice, it was an attempt to exploit colonial resources. And I think that is an important thing to understand when we are thinking about the nature of policing. Because if the aim is exploitation, if the aim is extracting resources, that essentially defines the nature of policing. It sets policing in a particular context. As I often say, if someone comes to your house to steal, they don't need your consent, right? They didn't need you to say, oh yes, you are a wonderful thief, you can take whatever you want away, or anything. That's irrelevant. And as we will see shortly, precisely because of the different mission of colonial policing, the very arrangement and the kind of governance you had of colonial policing differed from what we had at the metropolitan areas. By metropolitan, I mean in London. Okay, I will show you shortly how the period that the Gold Coast Police were created, the year, was more or less the same year that the London Police were created. But the way that they were governed was completely different, okay, because they had a different mission. All right. So these are essentially some of the issues as I've highlighted on the slide. The aim was to serve as a kind of intelligence officers for the colonial administrators. They wanted information about what was happening in the hinterlands, okay? And British colonial rule took the form of what they call indirect rule, right? So they ruled through traditional rulers to the people. But they required, in many cases, colonial police officers at the traditional palaces, right? The houses of the kings and chiefs, so that they can provide them with information about what was happening at the countryside. And the recruitment policy, as I have suggested there, was essentially to draw from local militia and soldiers. Again, we bear in mind the backdrop, the background, which is exploitation of resources. And so relied heavily on local militia and armed services. But of course, if you read the colonial accounts, what becomes easily noticeable is that the colonial police were said to be really poor. They were not as effective as the colonial administrators thought. There were allegations about bribe taking. There were allegations about corruption and alcoholism. There were allegations of lateness and absenteeism at posts. There were allegations of even nepotism, in the sense that if you knew your family or relatives had engaged in some sort of misconduct, they were reluctant in arresting them. So the initial diagnosis of the reasons for their ineffectiveness was that they were ill-equipped, they were poorly paid, and that meant you couldn't attract well-educated police officers to the force. Subsequently, colonial administrators thought that actually the problem wasn't so much the quality of the recruits as in, or even the conditions of their service. But it was that these are people too close to the locals, and therefore were compromised. So the solution will be to bring in outsiders, right? So they will go to northern Nigeria, for example, to import military personnel to come and patrol the Gold Coast, right? Northern Nigeria, it's quite a distance from Ghana, to try to do that. So the idea was that the locals were not trustworthy. Let's bring in external or outsiders who were somehow disconnected or disinterested. Let's put it that way. They were disinterested in the issues at hand. Of course, that has implications, right? First and foremost, we know that colonial police were generally perceived to be external intrusion, aliens, as they will call them, foreigners who had been brought in to oppress local people. And if there's disconnection between locals and colonial police, the idea of bringing in foreign officers only widened that gap, right? It made it worse. It reinforced the notion that somehow these officers were an alien institution. That situation, as I suggest here, has continued because it's not uncommon to have police transfers. So a new police chief takes over at the top, and he decides that he has to move some of the officers around, right? So you are in the southern part of Ghana, you are moved to the north or to the middle belt, or even within the south, you are moved to an urban area or a peri-urban area. And the reason has often been that officers staying at a particular post for too long become compromised, right? And I think we can see here the implications of such policy for long-term police community engagement. Because the ideas sometimes behind neighborhood policing or community policing is that we want officers who know the local community, are able to build right relationships with the local people to facilitate the flow of information, to partner local people to solve crimes. Okay. this is just an example of how colonial police are dressed earlier on. As you can see, these are essentially the militia with their funny guns and dresses. And then you've got later on towards post-colonial independence, you have a more what seems to be civil dressing for the police. Okay. But I suggested earlier that if you look at London at the same time that the Ghanaian or the Gold Coast police were created, these were the efforts that were made in London by Robert Peel to legitimize the police, right? His concern was to create a police force based on what Max Weber describes as a kind of bureaucratic ethos, right? Principles of the rule of law, for example, principles of impartiality in the way that police did their work, a strategy of the minimalist use of force. Now, that is just the opposite of what happens under colonial rule, right? So here you have two police forces created about the same time, but the principles, the efforts at governance here or at legitimizing here were different from what was happening in this other context. As you can see from here, issues about effectiveness, accountability underpin what happened in the case of London as opposed to colonial rule. And I will suggest later three key principles that you could say governed or underpin colonial rule, colonial policing. And to some extent, those principles continue in many post-colonial societies, which raises concerns about sometimes the terminologies we use when we talk about colonial and post-colonial policing. Are we really talking about it in terms of a qualitative difference in what police do, or is just a certain timeline that different guards took over from colonial administrators? Okay. So, of course, a really important issue in the context of colonialism is whether we can talk about legitimacy at all. Can we really talk about a legitimacy in the context of colonial rule? Because legitimacy has in it a notion of shared values, let's put it that way. It's a moral recognition that those in power have the right to exercise that power, and in many cases to expect a certain level of obedience from power audiences. But it's very hard to see how, at least in the kind of colonialism that happened in Africa, you can think about the notion of shared values, right? Because just some few years before 1831, we were talking about slave trade. And slavery presumed that somehow these other people were not humans, right? I was telling some of your colleagues that if you read adverts around the time of slavery in Liverpool, England, they advertise slaves like they advertise tomatoes or bananas or whatever, okay? Fresh products have arrived, okay? Not that they are cabbages or something like that, but human beings that have arrived and being traded. So it seems very hard in such a context to say that the colonial administrator and the colonized somehow shared a certain notion of what was wrong or right, which provides a foundation to justify power, right? Shared values means that you recognize me as a human being, and I do that in return. And therefore, we can have a conversation about the nature of power, about what is right or wrong in the exercise of power. But if I don't recognize you in the first instance as being human, as being worthy of engagement, then that creates a certain level of difficulty in that respect. And it means then that if we don't recognize each other as human, there cannot be rules and precepts and procedures that are morally binding. Okay, I'm sure you might have a different view, which we could discuss after I have gone on a bit. Okay, so what some have suggested is that colonial rule might be what you call a limiting case, right? Yes, legitimacy is important in analysis of colonial policing and colonial rule, but not in the sense that power could be justified in that respect, but that precisely because power could not be justified, right? We need legitimacy to explain why colonial policing struggled. We need legitimacy to explain why colonial rule came to an end in many respects, because it was the lack of legitimacy that somehow freed people up to resist colonial administrators. But we don't need legitimacy in terms of analyzing situations of obedience or disobedience, right? I think it would be really challenging to describe even instances of obedience. I'm not saying that there wouldn't be certain individuals who somehow believed that colonial administrators were nice people, they had good intentions, they are able to somehow protect them one way or the other, and therefore they genuinely felt that these were rightful people in authority. I'm not saying that there wouldn't be situations like that, but at a more general level, I think it would be difficult to sustain that line of argument. Okay. So colonial rule, as Mbembe tells us, it's a case where sovereignty was devoid of any notion of rightness, right? Any notion of rightness, in the sense that at least we talk about it in liberal democratic context, right? That was somehow there's some civil engagement between power holders and their audiences, between governments and citizens, that I can question power. I can ask, why do you have the right to stop and search me? How should I lodge a complaint against an officer? How should I remove a parliamentarian or even a president from power? Those are not the kind of right notions that you have in a colonial context. So what we can say in the end is that colonial policing is characterized by these notions. First of all, it is what you might call peremptory, in the sense that it is authoritarian, it is brutal. It might not always be brutal, that's not what the notion is, but it is power that in many ways is unrestrained. Okay? And I'm sure both in Brazil and in any other context where there was colonialism, we have accounts of how brutal power could be. It was ingratiating in the sense that police officers were always looking to winning favors with their political masters, right? They wanted to do what pleased their administrators, not what was a service to the local community. I mean, across sub-Saharan Africa, in many of the accounts of colonial policing in the Caribbean, in Asia, what you find is that colonial policing had little to do with serving the needs of the local people. It had to do with responding to the needs of the political establishment and the political elite. And in many cases, these principles or this ideology that underpin colonial policing continues in many post-colonial contexts, right? So they were ingratiating and they were subservient not to the local community, but to the political class. Okay? Today, when we talk about accountability in the context of liberal democratic context, we are talking about, in some cases, civilian oversight, right? And we see a number of police organizations making efforts at not police organizations, they don't like it very much, but political elite in some countries establishing external oversight commissions, what they call independent police complaint commissions, for example, to try to hold police to account, to try to ensure that police serve the needs of local communities. And in many cases also you have notions of community policing within that framework. Let's work together to serve your needs. You don't have that in the case of colonial policing. Okay. Of course, I should qualify that to say that it did not mean colonial police or colonial administrator did nothing to reform the police. I mean, periods of riots, of civil disobedience, of struggle for independence in Ghana resulted in 1948 in a major confrontation between the police and civil colonial people, resulting in shootings and the killing of 3 ex-servicemen in Accra. And what colonial administrators did was to appoint a commission of inquiry, which I think is significant because this is still under colonial rule. And the aim of the commission of inquiry is what you have there, to look at ways of reorganizing the police. And this was 1951, 6 years before independence. And I think it's instructive even today when we talk about ways to reform policing. When we talk about community policing, we talk about democratic policing principles. These were the 4 principles that Arthur Young, who was the person appointed to look into reorganization of the police, advocated. He says, let's change the way we do policing in this context. Let's reform the police to ensure that they live up to these principles. First of all, we should have a police force that is less ingratiating and subservient to the political elite, to one that serves the needs of the local communities. Let's have a police force that is efficient, that is effective, that is not regime policing, as we often say, but it is policing that is directed at serving the local community. Of course, as you will see in the 3rd principle, it's not only in 2016 that politicians try to interfere with what police do. This has been a long-standing issue in any accounts of policing. But here we have a notion that making police non-partisan. Of course, the notion is not that you have a police force that is not political. There is no police force in the world that is not political. The question is not to have a police force that is not partisan in terms of politics. But policing work is always political. What the police should do, how resources are allocated to them, how police should be held into account, all those are political decisions. They are not some sort of neutral organization. So this is the pre-colonial period, or if you like, the colonial period leading up to independence. As I said initially, independence was in 1957. And one of the interesting things is that the first president of Ghana appears to recognize the need to change the ideology that underpinned the police. But ultimately, he did very little about it. Partly because some political dissidents tried to use the police to assassinate him. One failed assassination attempt somehow sparked this rather strong arm approach to controlling the police in order to ensure that. So there's an argument, there's a debate as to whether policing would have been any different without that incident, because here you have someone who has diagnosed what the problem of colonial policing was and said this is what we needed to do. And then just some few years later, he suffers an attempted assassination by a police officer and decides that actually we cannot create such an autonomous police force because they could become potentially dangerous in terms of politics. But between 1957 and 1992, we've had a series of military interventions in politics. So you have civilian rule truncated by military incursions. By military, I mean the army getting into politics, and then they hand over to civilians, and then they come back. Just a kind of revolving door until 1993. And since 1993, Ghana has had multi-party democratic governance, and it's one of the most stable countries in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay. Of course, the issues that I alluded to in the colonial period persist, right? Issues about police integrity, issues about police, the militarization of the police, lack of accountability, police effectiveness or the lack of it. These remain persistent issues into the colonial period. And later, I would, if I manage to get there before I run out of time, there's an argument as to why this is the case. And one argument is that policing in the colonial period, the independence struggle, the elite who were struggling for independence, did not so much question the ideology that underpinned policing, right? It's fine to have a police force that somehow protected the interests of the political elite. The problem is that we are not the elite, okay? We want to be in charge. And once we are in charge, these instruments of governance can remain the same, right? So therefore, they did very little to try to reform the police. The other argument is that the independence struggle focused so much on undermining the legitimacy of institutions. And in many people's minds, there is no difference between colonial and post-colonial governments. So the kind of illegitimacy they felt for the police have been carried over into the post-colonial period. And that creates a sort of difficulty into that. I'm sure some of us also are aware of another line of thought, which is that we shouldn't rely so much on colonialism as our analytical framework, because for how long can you continue to blame colonial rule for the quality of policing you have today? And that what you actually have today is what Max Weber calls patrimonialism, right? Neo-patrimonialism, in the sense of you have formal legal arrangements like a constitution that on paper looks really wonderful, right? If you look at the constitutions of many countries, you would think this is a really wonderful police force. The arrangements for accountability, there are arrangements for how we should recruit police officers and do it in a way that is transparent, it's not corrupt. There are arrangements that on paper appear to be quite liberal in terms of even how we appoint police chiefs. But this formal arrangement lives alongside an informal kind of decision framework in which social relationships, what some people might, in polite circles, call social networks or social capital, is what inform a lot of the police decision making, right? So it is not colonial rule as such. It is a political elite that wants to have some level of control over the state. And that is the explanation for the kind of, I'm sure these debates are not uncommon even in here too. Okay, so, I just want to talk about two broad things. One has to do with issues about crime in a democratic context, and then some discussion about police integrity and efforts being made in Ghana to try to deal with those issues. And of course, questions about police officers themselves and how in efforts at democratic police reforms, we might need to sometimes rethink the way we do these reforms. So as David Bailey has suggested, democracies face a huge challenge in terms of creating the conditions for people to exercise their democratic rights. And they are jeopardized in cases where there is chronic ineffectiveness. And there's a long-standing argument in the literature as to whether transitions to democracy are good or bad in terms of law and order. Okay? There are those who say democratic transitions will result in more civil interactions, that we should expect crime rates to decline. Others argue that democratic transitions will result in the immediate term increase in crime, followed by declines in crime rates. If you look at more Marxist explanations, they will say democracy is closely linked with capitalism, and under conditions of capitalism, we should never expect crime to decline. We should expect, of course, the inequalities in society will continue to generate crime in that sense. I don't know about Brazil, or Sao Paulo, but in Ghana, it's quite a struggle to get reliable police statistics, to do any form of analysis. So what I'm going to show you here, I don't know how seriously you want to take it. Although there is an argument to be made that when you look at certain types of crimes, like very serious crimes, violent crimes, homicides, yes, official statistics might not capture all the crimes that happen, but they are very good in giving you an indication of the trend, right? So they are useful in terms of overall trend, but they are not useful in terms of telling you the exact volume of crime at any point in time, okay? What criminologists call the dark figure of crime. That proportion of crime in any society that is never reported to the police. There are various reasons for that. Sometimes people don't think their victimization is serious enough to bother the police, or they don't have confidence in the police, or they don't think the police can do anything about it, even if they want it, right? If your laptop is stolen and you reported it to the police, good, but you're not seriously thinking that the police are going to find your laptop for you. In most cases, it will not happen. However genuine the efforts of the police are, okay? But there are certain types of offenses that it seems unlikely that they will not be reported to the police, at least in some societies. Homicide is an example, okay? But even then, one needs some kind of qualification again, because we know that policing is largely an urban activity. It's not rural activity in many cases, because crime rates are higher in urban areas than they are in rural areas. And we know that in many rural areas, at least in Africa, when people die, they might not even report it to the authorities. They just bury them within a short period. For some people, for religious reasons, they will bury the dead the next day. So you never have accurate death records, okay? I know there have been some studies in Brazil where they have tried to use multiple sources to look at violence trends. So they go to medical records, accident units, hospital accident units to gather data. They look at death records to see the causes of death. And then, of course, police statistics. Some people use multiple sources. Okay. So having said that, I'm not sure what weight you are going to put on this. But this just shows you a very rough guide of the crime rates over that period. And I told you initially that this is a brief period of civilian government, right? 1979, there was a military coup. They handed over briefly. After 3 months in power, they handed over to civilian government. So between late 1979 to the 31st of December 1981, there was civilian government. Okay, the same military guy who came in 1979 came back again in 1981, and then ruled all the way to 1993. Okay, so between 1981 and 1993 is a period of military rule. But as you can see, the homicide rate seems to plummet drastically. It's not entirely clear why that is happening. Popular discourse in contemporary Ghana suggests that, military rule were doing well, you dare not go and commit certain crimes, they were having this stronghold over society. If you listen to that line of argument, it will suggest that these data were somehow reliable, but I'm not too sure about that. Some will say this accounting doesn't take into account political killings, right, in a military context. So it's very difficult to tell. And some of the reasons I gave earlier about rural areas, people being less willing to report deaths to the authorities, gives this a kind of... but if we were to follow the argument that we should expect transition to democracy to be followed by sudden rise in crime, followed by a decline, this would seem to suggest something along those lines, right? Democratic governance here, we see some sort of increase in homicide rates. They remain more or less stable. I'm not too sure what was happening here to suggest this spike, but here again is civilian rule, and you have a decline to the levels that were in the 1980s. I still don't have the data for this period to be able to tell whether there's going to be another rise or going to be a fall. Okay, but I think Theresa Caldera, she's done some analysis of homicide and interpersonal violence in Brazil, and her analysis will seem to contradict this kind of transition to democracy being followed by declines in homicide rates, right? But the arguments, the explanations are a bit complex, and I'm sure you know some of them. We could have a discussion about that. The same with robberies, and I don't want to bore you. Of course, when you have crime, there's a question about multiple actors in the provision of security. For some people, they resort to the police. Others engage in vigilante violence of the kind that you can see here. This is a young man suspected of theft, and others are chasing him down the streets and trying to lynch him. Okay. For the rich, they try to exclude themselves into what we call gated communities. And again, my knowledge of gated communities in Brazil comes mainly from Nancy Sepa-Hughes and Theresa Caldera, the work that they have done in Brazil. And they suggest that there are similar developments in Brazil. Okay. And these gated communities, they normally sell them in terms of security, right? We can protect you, leave this world of danger and struggle, and come to live in these peaceful areas. We've had some discussion already about whether gated communities make people safer than non-gated communities. We did some data analysis in 2000 and collected some data in 2010, comparing gated communities with different classes of non-gated communities, right? So you have a gated community, then you have high-class non-gated community, middle-class non-gated community, and lower-class non-gated communities, to see whether there are any differences in reported victimization, in fear of crime, and in what some sociologists call collective efficacy, which is the willingness of people to intervene for the good of the community. And just to move on, these are some of the items. If you want the slides, I can make them available to you later. But you can see here that the key thing is this, right? This is a meta analysis. The key thing is this: if it's clear to the, if there is a statistically significant difference between gated communities and non-gated communities, we should have this diamond either clearly to the left or to the right of this bar, okay? But as you can see, the only difference in levels of violence is between gated communities and lower class non-gated communities, okay? That is the place that it appears that levels of violence differ from non-gated communities, okay? If you look at the violence, I mean neighborhood violence, okay? Things happening in your neighborhood. If you look at victimization levels, again, they do not differ, right? So you are not safer living in a gated community than you are in a non-gated community. And if you speak with police officers, they will say that sometimes there are criminals living in those gated communities, although they are rich. They are the ones that seem to sometimes be the kingpins of some of these organized groups. Okay. In terms of fear of crime, again, you don't really, you don't see much difference between the two communities, okay, right? And the explanation that some urban geographers have given is that the very walls of the gated community convey a symbolic message that there is danger out there. So there's always a constant reminder that you might become a victim of crime. So we shouldn't expect them to be any safer than that. Okay. There are issues about why people might support the police in the fight against crime. If you look at the literature more generally, the suggestion is that people support the police to fight crime if they perceive the police to have treated them fairly, right? So if you think they are respectful, they are neutral or impartial, you're more likely to do that. But with a study that I did in 2006 suggested that in the context of Ghana is the effectiveness of the police that might be the driving force. And we've already had some discussion about what effectiveness actually means in some of these contexts, because we presume that it's necessarily something that is good in itself, but what people might have in mind is a rather tough policing tactics, which do not necessarily promote issues of human rights and the rule of law and all that. Okay. The explanation for this, again, not to bore you with it, we can trace it back to the kind of issues that I was raising in the colonial policing context. That colonial policing, or the police in post-colonial settings, the former state sits alongside a kind of primordial public. This is the public of traditional institutions. Okay? Chieftaincy, kinship arrangements remain very strong in Ghana. And the kind of moral attachment that people have for these institutions is different from the attachment they have with the former state. Okay? Because the norms and the values that underpin the chieftaincy institution are norms that people generally share, right? Because in Max Weber's terms, this is a traditional authority structure, isn't it? That the customs, the laws have been transmitted over time. People share these things. And they would contribute to the primordial public materially, but they don't expect material benefits. They expect some kind of social recognition. They expect some kind of psychological benefits in the sense of people thinking of them highly. Okay? But if you look at the civic public, and these terms, of course, they do not mean one is good or bad, right? Primordial and civic, they are not moral judgments. They're just descriptive terms. The civic public is that of the post-colonial state. And the argument is that it lacks legitimacy. And therefore, when people engage with the institutions of the post-colonial state, they do so purely in terms of self-interest. What is it? What is in it for them? Purely instrumental considerations. So why should I report crime to the police? Why should I volunteer information to the police? Would I do so purely because I think they are the rightful institution to deal with these matters? Or I think somehow that they have given some indication that they are effective. And if I were to report crime to them, they will use that information to provide collective security for those of us in that neighborhood. That's the discussion, and I'm sure we can talk about it. Finally, if I to just go on to issues about police integrity, the Ghana police, like many police forces in sub-Saharan Africa, struggle with issues of integrity that people sometimes do not quite believe that they stand for some of their mission of serving people with integrity. And as you can see from this Afrobarometer surveys, you have equivalent in Latin America barometer. And it will be interesting to see what the Sao Paulo police, where they stand in relation to the other institutions. You see here, the latest is 2014. If you are interested in the trends from 2002 to date, the data is available online for you to look at. But as you can see, the police are really, everybody is doing badly, okay? They're not, it's not, at least in terms of public perceptions. These are public perceptions. Everyone is doing badly. And sometimes when we speak with the police, this is some of the justifications they say. So why are you singling us out? Right? Everyone else is doing it. Why? What makes us so special that our corruption has to be taken so seriously? Which itself is a very serious line of argument, because yes, you cannot have, it will be difficult to have a police force with the highest level of integrity in a society that is corrupt, right? It's very difficult because policing doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's shaped by the larger political ethos about the customs, the laws, everything in that context. So there's a certain level of understanding when they argue like that. But on the other hand, we know that the police are key to maintaining rule of law in any society. And therefore, their corruption, at least police and the courts, their corruption will seem to be something to be taken seriously. So as you can see, they are top. They have always been top, right? All the time they are perceived to be the most corrupt in Ghana. But actually, if you look at the trends, sometimes it reduces a little bit, maybe to 83%, right? And sometimes they go up again to 89%. All right. It'll be interesting to hear from you how the police in Sao Paulo compare with these other institutions in terms of perceptions of corruption. Okay. Of course, like any police force, they claim they are interested in dealing with the issues of corruption. And I will show you later some genuine efforts that the police are making to try to deal with the issue of corruption. Largely because of the corruption, as you can see, levels of trust in the police is not particularly high. Okay. I have written elsewhere that the relationship between corruption and trust is complicated, right? We should never assume that every instance of experience of corruption necessarily translates into distrust for the police. It depends on the context of the corruption, right? Is it extortion, or it's a case of someone who is a suspect trying to bribe a police officer? It makes a whole lot of difference if it's consensual or it is one that is extortion. But as you can see here, over the period, the police, where are they? Okay, they're over here. The latest survey, they are at par with the tax authorities, but of course there are not many people who deal with the tax authorities, okay? But at least quite a number of people who deal with the local government, councils and district assemblies. So the police, as you can see, those who say they don't trust them at all, or they trust them very little, it's quite high for the police. Whether this is explained by the perception of corruption or not is very difficult to tell. Okay. So this is what the police are trying to do. They are trying to introduce cameras. There's some evidence I will show you shortly. And I think you probably have read also from the US and from other places that body-worn video cameras are increasingly a popular intervention by some police forces to try to deal with misconduct on the streets. Of course, it doesn't deal with all types of corruption. We know that. Probably what some people call grand corruption doesn't happen on the streets for you to record these things. But what we know is that it's often the corruption that happens on the streets that most people see, which then might have implications for trust. So, for example, if you board a commercial vehicle in Accra, and sometimes a police officer stops the driver, and the driver thinks that the officer wants money, so he puts money in his license, goes to give it to the police officer. Sometimes the police officer will collect the money. Sometimes he says no. But if the officer accepts the money, the driver comes in, everybody knows that this is what has happened. And if that vehicle has 24 people, this is 24 witnesses to a relatively minor infraction. Okay. But this is what the police are trying to deal with. Of course, he's not a Ghana police officer. Okay. So these are some of the benefits that it is claimed the body cameras can have. They can help reduce use of force, complaints against officers, and in the end, increase confidence and trust in the police, or enhance police legitimacy. There has been some studies to suggest that the cameras can even help in terms of capturing better evidence and early guilty pleas, because you confront the suspects with video evidence and they would say, yes, okay, I did it. And okay. So this is the first experiment that was done in California by a master's student at Cambridge. He had some of his officers on a shift where the cameras, and in the next shift, the same officers did not wear the cameras, to see whether wearing the cameras made a difference in terms of the use of force and complaints against officers. And this is the evidence that he produced. So this is where the experiment started. So before the experiment, after the experiment. But as you can see, this is an unusual police force because the complaints levels are low to start with, right? We are starting from a really low level. I show it just because it's the main experiment that has been done so far. There's so many others going on that maybe in the next 2 years we'll have better evidence to speak to this. But it's the principle involved. Okay. So as you can see, after the experiment, you see a decline in levels of complaints received against police officers. But interestingly, the number of contacts did not change, right? The fact that the officers were wearing the cameras did not mean the public avoided them. The police have always kept records of police-public contacts. And therefore, you could compare the number of contacts before and after the experiment. And there was no decline in that sense. Use of force, as you can see, again, a similar decline in the levels. And I'm sure when we have the slides, we can look at it closely for ourselves. So this is what the Ghana police want to do, a similar experiment with traffic police. And they see this as potentially useful in enhancing public trust in the police, reducing complaints against officers and bribery in these interactions. The experiment should start at some point this year with some of the companies involved in these cameras. Of course, they don't come cheap, as you can imagine. But they are at least a promising start in the sense that if you get an officer into a certain mindset that collecting bribes is not a good idea, hopefully even without the cameras, they will maintain that sort of cognitive. If you want to read about the intervention, the nature of the experiment, I will be happy to provide you the details later. So, okay. So as I said, these are some of the expected outcomes. I have so far been talking about issues that has to do with what police should do for the public, right? They should, in their interactions with the public, be civil, we are told. And the police are concerned about reducing misconduct, enhancing public trust and confidence in the police. But what we normally, or we usually haven't paid much attention to, is the police officers themselves, right? The police organization itself is some kind of society, right? In which there are citizens with democratic rights, whether they are constables, sergeants, inspectors, chief inspectors, or in your case, the different ranks in the military and the civil police. And sometimes the relationship between the civil lower ranks and the senior officers is not that civil, okay? Respect for rights, responding to complaints or dealing with complaints are often fraught with a lot of difficulties. So what some have argued is that, especially if you are interested in democratic reforms, we should approach it as a kind of double-sided strategy of transforming social power relations within the police department and then between the police department and citizens. So a kind of a double-edged kind of sword. Okay. As you can see, the relations within police departments in Ghana are a bit difficult. Lower rank officers, some of them, I mean, this is not a broad generalization that all officers face these difficulties, but there are instances where some officers, junior ranks, feel that they are not treated with respect and dignity among, and this is quite a good description of some of the issues involved in the relations between junior ranks and their supervisors and management. And you can see how this will create a certain difficulty. We could buy them the cameras, but if the quality of relations between lower ranks and their supervisors, if that doesn't change, it will be difficult to sustain the kind of democratic gains that the police anticipate. Okay. So there are studies, for example, to try to see whether the relations within the police department in a way help us to predict officers' attitudes to democratic principles. Okay, there are studies from England to suggest that officers who think they have been treated fairly are more likely to respect the rights of suspects, okay, and to treat citizens with respect and dignity. This study is from this data. These results are from Ghana, and as you can see, just first of all, of course, the police are so key in any democratic governance that their support for democracy can have important implications. And we see here that in terms of the factors that might help us to explain support for democracy, procedure justice, okay, and distributive justice. Distributive justice essentially means like treating different people similarly, okay. This is supposed to be organizational justice, okay, like treating officers with respect and dignity. Those seems to be the key issues. Now, what is really very difficult to understand, and I don't have the answer, although I did the study, is that procedure justice appears to have this impact on satisfaction with democracy. That officers who believe that they are not treated any differently from other officers appear somehow not to be satisfied with the way democracy works. And again, that goes back to some of the issues to do with the primordial public and the civic public that I alluded to earlier. And we can have a discussion about this as we head to one. How much time do I have? Okay, I'm almost done. All right. And again here, and this is really the key thing I wanted to highlight, commitment to procedure justice, i.e. Issues about fair treatment, respecting citizens, being impartial, showing them respect and dignity. What we find here is that what happens within the police department has implications for how officers think about citizens. Okay, and I think it makes sense in a sense that if my supervisor doesn't listen, doesn't explain, doesn't treat me with respect and dignity, how am I supposed to go out on the streets and suddenly promote these principles when I'm dealing with suspects or I'm dealing with difficult communities? All right. So just to recap what I've been trying to suggest, that we cannot understand the nature of policing today without some history. And the key challenge, the key explanation is why, or the key challenge that issue that requires explanation is why colonial policing has survived. Okay, colonial policing in the sense of a policing that is characterized by authoritarian approach to citizens. Not authoritative, of course. We expect policing to be authoritative, but we don't expect it to be authoritarian. We don't expect it to be brutal. Why is it that policing in some post-colonial societies or police officers continue to be subservient to a certain section of society rather than serving the broader community? Is it purely because of a seed sown during colonial rule, which is very difficult to uproot? If that is the case, why is that seed so difficult to uproot? Or it is the case that we need a different theoretical framework to try to make sense of this persistence in a certain type of policing that doesn't quite reflect a new political culture. Okay? That culture, at least on paper, promotes principles of the rule of law, respect for human rights. It's very hard to find any police organization that they will show you in their operating procedures that you should beat suspects. You should arrest people arbitrarily, detain them outside the limits of the law. No police force will have those principles. But why is it that, in fact, policing reflects more of a colonial reality than a democratic environment? I think this is really the key challenge. And I don't know whether what I'm talking about is completely different from what your experiences have been, or in your own research, you'll find that these issues are very current in the case of Sao Paulo or any other states in Brazil. All right? Thank you. Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Quem tiver perguntas, como é, Penny? Grava lá. Bom, está aberto para perguntas.
Yes?
I have a question concerning something we've been discussing all week, actually, concerning police effectiveness. You said that in Ghana, when you tested the procedural justice hypothesis, you found that their police effectiveness explained more cooperation than procedural justice. My question is about the measurement of police effectiveness. I mean, are you talking about the judgment of how people judge the work of the police, or their normative expectations concerning the role of the police? I mean, are you looking backwards or forwards?
Is how they, at the time of the survey, judge the police. And I'm sure that would be influenced more by some historical experiences. And you're right that there's a challenge if we use a top-down questionnaire survey approach, that you never really know whether what you're measuring, it's also the kind of normative expectations people have of the police. So in that sense, I am unable to tell whether the instruments that were used reflected the normative expectations of people or not. I think the interesting approach is what you and your colleagues have adopted, which is to first try to understand what those normative expectations are about the effectiveness of policing. What is it that they mean when they talk about effectiveness? And then to try to make sense of its relationship with other outcomes or attitudes, right? Okay. So I can't tell you whether it reflects normative expectations or it doesn't, okay? And as we said, we discussed yesterday, when people say that the police are not effective, in some cases, it might not actually be a bad thing, okay? Because what they actually mean by police being effective is that they're shooting suspects or arbitrarily arresting people. So you can't just take that on the face of it and say, oh, this police force is doing badly, at least in the context of a liberal democracy, right? We need to understand, need to have a better understanding of what people mean by an effective police force. Okay. Yes?
It's more like comments. I think one thing that I was thinking about the body cam solution, because the whole legitimacy and procedural justice theory, it's based on the idea that you're not gonna be monitored all the time. You have to introject some values and standards and start to acting according to the law, and you're not obeying or compliance because you are being monitored, because you are afraid to get caught, because you are afraid. But the solution that we have to trying to control the police, it's putting this kind of a device, because it's like the idea that of them acting according to the law because they think is important, because they defend that as a value, is something that it looks harder. So it's easy to get like this path maybe to get it done anyway. But it's just I know it's harder, and I know this is one way to try to do it. It's just the idea that how could this generate legitimacy and other kinds of output that we wanted if we are going through in this kind of way. I mean, trying to monitor them and trying to I don't know, it's just
yeah, I think that's a really important observation. But there are different dimensions to this. First of all, if we understand legitimacy as some kind of a dialogue between the parties involved, and that dialogue, at least in this context, could be the kind that happened within the police organization, the kind that happened between the police organization and citizens. So if we have a problem with police misconduct and we come to an agreement that, yes, we can train officers, yes, we can do all the other things that we think are useful, but in the meantime, could we have something to, as just sometimes a symbolic act to the community that we are doing something about misconduct among our officers, right? It could be one way. I mean, if you look at the reports from some police forces in England and in the US, people do not object to the cameras, right?
The people or the police officers?
Both police officers. We have done a survey. The paper is being reviewed at the moment with police officers from England and Wales. And some of them see it as a good thing, that will protect them against what they consider to be frivolous complaints by the public, right? I go to a house, the guy is brandishing a knife, probably put it to someone's neck, throat. I shoot him, no one is there, okay? And it's my word against the family of the victim. And in some cases, they tend to believe the family than the police officer, okay? But if I have a camera that allows me to record everything that's happening, I am protected in that sense. So you got officers who, in my experience, a minority, who see it as an attempt by management to control them. But you also have quite a fair proportion of the officers that we have studied who say this will help to capture better evidence. This will help us this will protect us against accusations of racial discrimination, of misconduct in our interaction with the public. Okay, but I think we have to understand this in a broader context. I agree that it might not be a long-term solution. It's an immediate effort at dealing with a problem that appears to be having negative implications for trust and confidence. Okay.
And just one comment about it. Do you think it would be possible, like in the future, use this kind of video as a data to analyze how police officers act in daily basis?
Oh yes, it will be. There are questions about data protection, so you can imagine, yeah. So, sometimes the understanding, the concession that is made to police officers is that your supervisor will not have access to the footage. Okay, so it's not the case that you go and upload the footage and your supervisor sits in the office and he logs in to see what you are doing. No, right? You only watch that bit if there is an incident. If there is some contest about what happened, then we want to look at the footage to find out what actually transpired. But otherwise, it's really for the officer to record these things, to come back, look at them. And in the Rialto study, the officers went to log, they could track the logins and the officers logged in to watch the video several times. So for some of them, it's like a football team. And at the end of the game, being able to analyze the video of each person's performance and to say, oh, Matasaka, that's what Messi, you should have done that rather than going that way to allow Neymar to score or something like that, right? You can use it as a training tool, as a tool to help officers better understand what they do and to make the correct choices, right? But yes, there are data protection issues. And in many ways, from the standpoint of a researcher, it's actually a good thing, precisely for that reason. Because when it becomes routine, officers will not be too conscious of it. And they would interact normally with citizens. And you can have access to this data and code these interactions in very interesting ways. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Thank you.